Mary, could you talk us through the plot and how it unfolds?
Yes. Well, buckle up. I was describing the plot to somebody the other day, and I said, "It's just incredible. It's so twisty. It's like an HBO series." And I said this to Mark, and he said, "Well, you're right, because of course it was produced for serialisation, and therefore it does have that feeling of each sort of section of it has got some kind of major event. A character reappears who's disappeared, and there are these kind of wonderful reversals and wonderful sort of cyclical returns. It's just an incredible plot. So I may go on for some time." So the opening scene, as you said, Claire, it's this incredible. I can't really think of another novel that I've read that, as you say, so much like a sort of set of dominoes proceeds from this one single scene, a passage of over 20 years from this one moment. But it opens with Michael Henchard walking along a country road. He's walking in front of his wife, some way at a distance in front of her, and she is carrying their baby. It's a sort of child in arms, a little girl. And they arrive at a fair. They're clearly tired. It's been a long day. And they go and find some refreshment. And unfortunately, Michael Henchard is tempted into taking some rum into his, it's called furmity?
Mm-hmm.
In taking some rum into his furmity, which is a sort of porridge, right? It's a kind of...
Yeah.
And he gets drunk and decides that he's going to sell his wife. And there is, as you've quoted, this extraordinary kind of auction scene. And it seems as though actually no one's going to stand up and buy Susan until this man appears through the kind of curtains of the tent that they're in. He's a sailor, and he says that he'll take Susan, and they duly get up and leave. And then the fair ends, night falls, Henchard falls asleep in the tent, and there's this extraordinary scene of him waking the next morning with the mother of all hangovers, and he realizes that his wife and child are gone. And he then begins this kind of desperate search, looking around, trying to inquire where she's gone, and he can find no trace of her. And at the end of, I think it's a day or so, he, having been looking around, he goes into a church. And he goes and kneels at the altar and makes this solemn vow that he will not touch hard liquor for 21 years, because he's 21 at the time, and he's kind of replicating the span of his own life. Then we have this extraordinary kind of swoop in time forwards to a moment when the now teenage Elizabeth Jane, who is the daughter, or so we think, and Susan, the previously sold wife, who've, it seems, rather fallen on hard times, are entering Casterbridge, fictionalized Dorchester. And they've heard tell of Michael Henchard, and Susan doesn't really reveal to her daughter who this Henchard is. She just sort of says in rather vague terms, well, he's a relative. And as they enter Casterbridge, you suddenly get this sense of how the town itself will be this kind of extraordinary organism that is this kind of character in the book. And they hear snatches of conversation in the street. So they hear a discussion about how all the bread has gone bad in the town because the wheat has sprouted. And after a while, they sort of push through a crowd, and they see this gathering through the windows into the sort of town hall of the mayor, and they suddenly realize that the mayor is indeed Michael Henchard. And of course, we as readers, like them, have no idea what's happened to Henchard in this kind of intervening time. So it's a sort of huge shock to us as well as to them that in fact he is not the sort of man who's fallen on hard times as we might expect, but he is in fact the mayor. So then they then go to look for lodgings that night, and there's then this rather amazing scene where enter this character called Farfrae, who is this sort of dashing Scotsman who is entertaining the assembled company in this inn by singing romantic Highland songs. So that night, Henchard employs Farfrae as his corn factor. And thereby he becomes this incredibly successful character, and Henchard then really kind of comes into conflict with him because he becomes sort of jealous of him. Henchard wishes to atone for his past sins, and so he marries Susan, and Elizabeth Jane, his daughter, or he thinks is his daughter, comes to live in his house. So during the time that there is this sort of conflict and rivalry between Henchard and his previously adored corn factor, a woman from his past, the sort of hot babe from Jersey, Lucetta, appears, and she and Henchard have had some kind of previous romantic entanglement, the nature of which is not fully sketched for the reader, and she entreats him to return some letters to her that she'd previously written to him, and anyway, Henchard's fortunes unfortunately begin to deteriorate, and he dismisses Farfrae, who then goes and sets up his own business. And Henchard then goes and consults a sort of local weather prophet, kind of wise man, and makes a very bad bet on some weather, on what the harvest will do, and then really starts to lose money quite badly. Then Susan Henchard dies, and on her deathbed she hands a letter to Henchard that she intends to be opened on the day of Elizabeth Jane's wedding, and in it she reveals that her daughter is not actually Henchard's daughter. She is in fact the daughter of the sailor who bought her at the fair, and that she had simply given her the same name because the previous child had died, and she was so broken by this that she gave her the same name. Then we have this extraordinary scene when Henchard then is kind of horrified to discover this, all of his sort of joy in Elizabeth Jane. I think the line is, it sort of turns to ashes. And he begins to dislike her, to become annoyed by all of her little actions. Then there's an incredible scene in which Lucetta appears, now having, because of the convenient death of a rich relative, become a rich woman in her own right, then meets Elizabeth Jane at the graveside, or at Susan's graveside. And in this amazing scene in which the graveyard is described as the previous Roman cemetery of the town, and it describes the women with the Roman beads, the Roman skeletons of women in the ground alongside the skeleton of Susan. And at the graveside, she meets Lucetta, who naturally and obviously says, "Would you like to come and live with me and be my companion?" And Elizabeth Jane says, "Yes, what a lovely idea." And so she immediately moves out of her father's house because she's been finding that their relationship has deteriorated. Lucetta has obviously engineered this in the hope that by having Elizabeth Jane living with her, that will be a kind of lure for and convenient public excuse for Henchard to come and pay court to her and visit her in her house. But through a series of unpredictable circumstances, it's in fact Farfrae who comes to Lucetta's house, and thus begins the courtship of Farfrae and Lucetta. During this time, Henchard becomes basically destitute, and he's loved really only by Elizabeth Jane, who then moves out of the house of Lucetta and Farfrae. And then Lucetta and Henchard's former attachment becomes known in the town, and some of the local people who live in a place called Mixon Lane, which is a sort of den of iniquity, decide to arrange this kind of strange folk custom called the Skimmity Ride, the Skimmington, where how to describe it?
Just a shaming ritual.
Yeah, it's a shaming ritual where puppets of the people in question are created and then kind of paraded through the town. Lucetta, on seeing this and being so publicly shamed, dies of shock. Henchard tries to reconcile with Elizabeth Jane, but then, lo and behold, the sailor from the beginning, the first scene, reappears. And at the very moment that he arrives, Elizabeth Jane is sleeping in a next-door room, and he comes to Henchard's house, and Henchard, in that moment, decides to lie to him and tell him that Elizabeth Jane is dead. So he goes away again. Elizabeth Jane and Farfrae then marry, having been kind of sweethearts before. Newson then returns. Henchard flees in shame, wearing the same clothing and attire that he's wearing right at the start of the novel. And he dies alone on Egdon Heath, leaving a note to say that nobody should mourn him. The end.
Brilliant.
Well done. Well done.
A tour de force.